My name is Julian. To my family, I'm the ghost in the library, the 34-year-old man who smells of old paper and irrelevance. They call me the Archivist, a title they use not with respect, but with the same pitying tone one might use for a child who never outgrew his imaginary friends. My world is one of vellum, ink, and the quiet whispers of history. Theirs is a world of glass, steel, and the loud roar of commerce. What they don't know is that my quiet little world is about to swallow theirs whole. My father, Richard, is a titan of real estate, a man who sees city skylines not as places for people to live, but as a personal chessboard. My older sister, Amelia, is his queen, sharp, ruthless, and draped in the cold architecture of his ambition. Tonight is their coronation. We're in a penthouse restaurant overlooking the city, celebrating the final signing of the Vanguard Tower project, a billion-dollar deal that will be the crown jewel of my father's empire. They also don't know that the ground they're planning to build on is a lie. A lie I discovered 3 months ago, tucked away in a forgotten leather-bound folio in the deepest, most neglected corner of the city archive. A truth so powerful it could turn their billion-dollar tower into a pile of dust and lawsuits. I sit at the end of the long table, an afterthought in a bespoke suit I bought with my meager salary. The gift I brought for my father, a beautifully preserved hand-drawn map of the city from 1788, the year the original land grants were chartered, sits ignored next to a bottle of champagne. Earlier, when I gave it to him, he'd glanced at it for a second before clapping me on the shoulder. "Excellent, Julian. A reminder of the dirt we're turning into gold. You can hang it in your little office." Amelia had smirked. "Don't you have anything from this century, little brother?" The insult, as always, was a dull, familiar ache. It was the same ache I felt when my father refused to co-sign a loan for my master's degree, saying it was a waste of good money on a dead-end career. The same ache I felt when I used my own savings to secretly pay for our mother's headstone, a custom-carved piece of marble he deemed too extravagant. Now, the lawyers for both parties are present. The final contracts, a thick stack of arrogance and ink, are laid out on the table. My father stands, raising his glass. He gives a speech about legacy, power, and the future he is building. He thanks Amelia. He thanks his partners. He thanks the lawyers. He never once looks at me. He sits down, picks up a gold-plated fountain pen, and uncaps it. The room is hushed with anticipation. He looks over at me, a final glint of pity in his eyes. "Witness this, Julian," he says, his voice carrying across the table. "This is how the real world works. Not with dusty books, but with vision and will." He turns the contract to the final page, the pen hovering just above the signature line that will seal the deal and doom them all. The entire room is watching his hand, but I'm watching his eyes. He has no idea he's about to sign his own ruin. The tip of the pen touched the paper. A single, dark line began to form, the start of my father's signature. Father. My voice wasn't loud, but in the reverent silence of the room, it was a thunderclap. He didn't look up. His hand didn't stop. "Not now, Julian." Amelia shot me a look of pure venom from across the table, a silent, desperate command to disappear. "It's about Parcel 7B, I said, my voice steady, ignoring her. "The original riparian rights as chartered in the 1788 land grant." The pen stopped. The room's energy shifted from celebration to confusion. My father slowly lifted his head, his eyes burning with a rage so cold it could have frozen the champagne in its bucket. "What in God's name are you talking about?" he hissed, his voice dangerously low. Amelia forced a brittle laugh. "Gentlemen, my apologies. My brother is passionate about his historical trivia. It's hardly the time or place." She tried to wave it away, to dismiss me like a bad odor, but it was too late. One of the lawyers for the opposing side, a shrewd-looking man named Peterson, tilted his head. "The 1788 grant, our title search went back 100 years. That's standard. It came up clean." "Of course it did," I replied, turning my attention to Peterson, finally having found someone who spoke the language of diligence. "You searched the modern registry, the county records. You wouldn't find this there. It was recorded in the city archive's original folio under a different designation. The land wasn't just waterfront property. It had a name." My father's face was turning a deep shade of crimson. "Julian, I swear to God, if you don't get out of this room right now." "The map I gave you," I said. Cutting him off, my gaze locking with his. "The one you called dirt. If you'd looked closely at the southeast corner of Parcel 7B, you would have seen a small hand-inked symbol. It's a cross, not a religious marker. It's a cartographer's mark from that era. It signifies a potter's field." A murmur went through the lawyers. Peterson's eyes narrowed, no longer curious but sharply focused. "A potter's field?" he repeated. "A burial ground," I clarified, my voice echoing slightly in the stunned quiet. "For the city's indigent, it's unnamed, the forgotten." Richard slammed his fist on the table, making the glasses jump. "This is insane! He's making it up! It's a preposterous fantasy from a man who lives in the past! Security!" But no one moved. All eyes were on me. They could see the fury on my father's face, but they could also see the absolute certainty on mine. I let the silence hang for a moment before delivering the fatal blow. I looked past my apoplectic father, past my horrified sister, and directly at the legal teams on both sides of the table. The land grant of 1788 contains a perpetual covenant, an ironclad, unbreakable clause that was common in those days to protect consecrated or public trust lands from desecration by private enterprise. If you sign that contract, you are not just breaking ground. You will be building a billion-dollar tower on top of an historic, unmarked cemetery, and that, gentlemen, is a crime. The word crime hung in the air, sucking all the oxygen out of the penthouse. The confident smiles of the lawyers had evaporated, replaced by masks of cold, professional panic. Peterson, the sharp lawyer, was already discreetly tapping on his phone under the table, no doubt messaging his firm to start an immediate, frantic search of the city archive databases. Amelia's face was a ruin of disbelief and fury. "He's lying," she choked out, her voice thin. "Father, he's lying. This is revenge. For what? For not paying for his ridiculous degree?" I didn't even look at her. My gaze remained fixed on my father. He was no longer red with rage. He was pale, a ghastly, ashen white. He knew. In that moment I realized he knew. Maybe not the specifics, but he knew something was buried there, a risk he'd been willing to take, a corner he'd been willing to cut. He had always believed that money and power could bulldoze any obstacle, even history itself. "Show them," my father said, his voice a gravely whisper. "If you have proof, show them, or I will personally and professionally destroy you." "I'd be happy to," I said calmly. I reached into the inner pocket of my suit and pulled out a small, flat portfolio. I'd prepared this for weeks, my own quiet coronation. I slid it across the polished wood of the table until it stopped directly in front of Peterson. He opened it. Inside were not originals. I was too careful for that, but certified, notarized copies. The first was a high-resolution photograph of the 1788 map, with the Potter's Field symbol on Parcel 7B circled in red. The second was a copy of the original land grant. The vellum yellowed and the ink faded, but the language of the perpetual covenant was stark and clear. The third and final document was a court order. "What is this?" Peterson asked, his voice tight. "That," I explained, "is a temporary injunction, which I filed with a sympathetic judge at 4 p.m. this afternoon. It halts all development on Parcel 7B pending a full archaeological survey based on the historical evidence provided. It goes into effect at midnight tonight." I glanced at my watch. In approximately 3 hours, the room erupted. Lawyers scrambled, whispering furiously to each other. Amelia looked as if I had physically struck her. The Vanguard Tower wasn't just delayed, it was poisoned. The potential lawsuits, the public relations nightmare of excavating a historical graveyard, the sheer cost of the archaeological survey. The project was already bleeding money it hadn't even made. My father stared at the documents, his empire crumbling in a portfolio of my dusty books. He slowly looked up at me, and for the first time I saw not pity or anger in his eyes, but a sliver of something else. Fear. He had always seen me as weak, as insignificant, a ghost. But a ghost can haunt you. A ghost knows where the bodies are buried. He finally spoke, his voice hoarse with defeat. "Why, Julian? Why would you do this to your own family?" I thought of my mother's simple headstone. I thought of the years of dismissal, the casual cruelty. I thought of them seeing me not as a son or a brother, but as a failure they had to tolerate. "You don't see this as family," I said, my voice quiet but carrying the weight of decades. "You see it as a company, and in this company I was just a non-performing asset. Well, consider this my market correction." The penthouse, once a monument to their impending triumph, became a war room of hushed, frantic phone calls and shattered confidence. The opposing party's lawyers, led by Peterson, excused themselves with icy professionalism, their retreat a clear signal that the deal was not just on hold, but dead on arrival. They left my father and Amelia stewing in the ruins of their grand ambition. Amelia was the first to break the suffocating silence. She stalked around the table until she was standing right in front of me, her hands clenched into fists. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" she seethed, her voice a venomous whisper. "This wasn't just a building. This was everything, our future. You've ruined us, all for some petty, pathetic grudge." "Was it petty, Amelia?" I asked, finally meeting her enraged gaze. "Was it pathetic when you both laughed at me for wanting to study history? Or when Father told me I'd amount to nothing more than a librarian? You built your empire on the idea that the past is worthless. I just proved you wrong." My father, who had been sitting silently, a statue of defeat, finally stirred. He pushed his chair back, the sound scraping loudly in the quiet room. He walked not to me, but to the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the city skyline he had wanted to conquer. "The land," he said, his back to us. "I knew there were irregularities. My surveyors flagged some soil inconsistencies a year ago. They recommended a deeper probe. I buried their report. I paid them to forget it." He turned around, his face a mask of bitter resignation. "I gambled. I thought no one would ever look that deep. I never thought—" "You never thought it would be me," I finished for him. "The ghost in the library." His confession hung in the air, an admission not just of negligence, but of deliberate, calculated fraud. Amelia stared at him, her own anger momentarily eclipsed by shock. Her perfect, visionary father was a common cheat. "We can fix this," she stammered, turning her frantic energy back to the problem. "We can pay. We can move the remains, make a donation, spin it as honoring the city's history." "You don't get it, do you?" I said, standing up. "It's not about money anymore. The city's Historical Preservation Society already has copies of these documents. I sent them anonymously this morning. By tomorrow, every news outlet in this city will have the story. Billionaire titan Richard Sterling attempts to build luxury tower on forgotten pauper's grave. You can't spin your way out of that. You can't buy your way out of desecration." That was the final killing blow. It wasn't just a financial disaster. It was a legacy-destroying scandal. The Sterling name, which my father had worshipped and polished for decades, would be forever tarnished, associated with greed and a callous disregard for the dead. I looked from my sister's horrified face to my father's broken silhouette. I felt no joy, no triumphant rush of adrenaline, just a quiet, profound sense of closure. The scales were finally balanced. "I believe this is where I leave," I said, walking towards the door. "Where are you going?" Amelia cried out, a note of desperation in her voice. I paused at the door and looked back at them, two powerful people now trapped in a prison of their own making. "I have to get back to the archive," I said. "There's so much more to find." The next morning, the city awoke to the story I had seeded. It was on the front page of every paper, the lead story on every local news channel. The headlines were even more damning than I had imagined. My father wasn't just a callous developer. He was painted as a villain, a grave robber in a suit. His photo was everywhere, next to images of the 1788 map I had provided. My name was nowhere to be found. I was still a ghost, just as I'd planned. My phone started buzzing before 7 a.m. It was Amelia. I let it go to voicemail. Then came a text. "Call me. We need to talk. We can make this right." I deleted it. An hour later, a message from my father. "Julian, I was wrong about everything. Please, let's talk." I ignored them both. Their world of frantic damage control was no longer mine. I was in my element, the quiet, climate-controlled sanctuary of the city archive. The familiar smell of old paper was the only welcome I needed. Around noon, my phone rang with an unknown number. I answered cautiously. "Julian Sterling?" a man's voice asked. It was Peterson, the lawyer from the opposing firm. "Speaking," I said. "Mr. Sterling," he began, his tone a mix of professional respect and sheer curiosity. "My firm and my clients owe you a significant debt. You saved us from walking into a legal and ethical minefield of catastrophic proportions. The due diligence our team performed was frankly inadequate. You exposed that." "I just read a map," I replied simply. He chuckled. "You did more than that. You understood it. Listen, my firm would like to retain you on a permanent basis. We handle countless cases involving land rights, zoning, and historical precedents. Your unique skill set would be invaluable. We'd be prepared to offer you a position as head of a new historical diligence department. The salary would be substantial. I stood there amidst the silent shelves of history, a six-figure job offer dangling on the line. It was everything my father and sister thought defined success. It was the real world they had always insisted I join. But it wasn't my world. Thank you for the offer, Mr. Peterson. It's very generous, but I'm afraid my work is here. There was a pause on the other end. I see, he said, a note of surprise in his voice. Well, the offer stands should you change your mind. I hung up and looked around the archive. This wasn't a dead-end career. It was a kingdom, and I was its guardian. I had spent my life preserving the stories of others, the whispers of the forgotten. Now I had finally written my own. Later that week, I received a package. It was a legal document. My father had dissolved the Sterling Corporation. The Vanguard Tower was officially dead. Tucked inside was a handwritten note on his personal stationery. It said only 2 words, "You win." I folded the note and placed it in an empty archival box. I labeled the box Sterling Richard, 21st Century. It was just one story among millions, a quiet testament to an empire that had tried to erase the past, only to be erased by it. And I, the ghost, the archivist, the man who lived in the past, was the only one left to tell the tale. My hands weren't stained with ink. They were the hands of a historian, a truth seeker, and I had just corrected the one historical record that had been wrong for my entire life, my own.